McKenzie's bar had always been a place of refuge for the lost. It wasn't much to look at, just a sagging two-story building on the outskirts of town with an old neon sign that flickered like a dying heart. The town had changed over the years. New condos popped up near the center of town. The mall had expanded, and chain stores lined the main strip. But McKenzie's had remained, tucked away, like a relic from a time that no one seemed to care about anymore. The building was as weathered as the regulars who still came in, those who didn't have much else to turn to. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of stale beer, whiskey, and the faintest hint of tobacco smoke. Even though smoking indoors had been banned for years, it lingered. The kind of smell that wrapped around you and stayed with you long after you left, clinging to your clothes, your skin. The walls were cluttered with old memorabilia, posters, faded photographs, and a few framed newspaper clippings that had turned yellow with age. There was a sense of timelessness here, not in a romantic way, but in a way that suggested the world had moved on and McKenzie's had been left behind. Ed, the bartender, had been there longer than he cared to admit. 32 years, give or take. He wasn't a sentimental guy, but there was something about the place. He wasn't just the bartender, he was the keeper of its history. He'd seen a lot of things in that bar. Fights that spilled out into the parking lot, laughter that had the edge of desperation, faces that had grown older and harder with each passing year. But tonight, there was something different. A feeling in the pit of his stomach. Like a bad storm was coming, but it hadn't yet arrived. The man who walked in was tall, but not in a way that commanded attention. His thin, sallow face made him look almost sickly, and his suit, dark, crisp, well-tailored, seemed out of place in the dingy surroundings of McKenzie's. His hair was combed back sharply, his eyes hidden behind dark, glossy sunglasses, despite the dim lighting inside. Ed didn't think much of it at first. There were always out-of-towners stopping by, looking for a drink or a place to hide. The man sat at the bar, ordered a whiskey without looking at the menu, and downed it quickly. Ed poured another, keeping his eyes on the man as he did. There was something about the way the stranger drank. Like he wasn't just consuming alcohol, but trying to erase something. "Rough night?" Ed asked, trying to break the silence. The man glanced up, his eyes hidden in shadow, but the faintest gleam of something, pity or maybe malice, flashed across his face. "You have no idea," he said softly. A few minutes later, he stood up and made his way to a corner booth where a small group of regulars sat. There was a momentary hesitation from them, as if they knew something Ed didn't. The man sat down without asking, and the group welcomed him like an old friend. But Ed could see them. He could feel them. Their body language was off, tense, like they were waiting for something. But what? The lights flickered. It was subtle, just a twitch, but it made Ed's stomach churn. He didn't understand why. He'd seen the power go out dozens of times in McKenzie's, but tonight it felt different. The stranger raised his glass in a slow, deliberate motion. "To the end of McKenzie's," he said, and the others echoed him in a hollow chorus. Ed's heart skipped a beat. He wiped his hands on the bar towel, but his palms were slick with sweat. What the hell did that mean? The man stood up, his eyes fixed on Ed now, glowing faintly, and a cold dread settled over him. The man's lips twitched in something like a smile, but it was wrong. There was no warmth behind it. "It's all over now," he said in that low voice, almost a whisper, and then, "You're all dead already." The bar went dead silent. The lights flickered again, longer this time, and when they came back on, the bar had transformed. The tables were overturned, chairs lay scattered across the floor, and the room felt unnaturally cold, like the very air had been sucked from it. The man was gone. The worst part? The blood. The blood was everywhere, staining the floor in dark pools. It was so fresh, the metallic scent of it so thick, It was as if someone had been killed in that very moment. Ed stood frozen, heart pounding, eyes wide. He had seen things in this bar, many things, but this felt like something else. This wasn't just some drunken fight gone wrong. And then, from the corner of his eye, he saw them, the regulars, standing by the door, their faces pale and blank. Their eyes were empty, lifeless, and one of them was smiling. The Dead Oak Tavern wasn't much of a tavern, if you were being honest. It was a relic. The kind of place you'd only find on the outskirts of a small town, surrounded by fields and winding back roads. Its dark wood paneling, worn stools, and heavy, musky air told the story of decades gone by, of long nights, of quiet sorrow, and even quieter laughter. Marla had only been working there for 3 months, but in that time, she'd learned more about the locals than she ever wanted to know. They weren't bad people, not by any stretch of the imagination, but they were heavy. Their eyes always seemed tired, like they carried the weight of something too large for anyone to lift. And they knew things about the town and the people who lived there. Marla had heard whispers of strange happenings, of eerie figures wandering the streets at night, but she always laughed it off. A small town's version of ghost stories, nothing more. That was until he came in. It was just past midnight. The last of the customers had stumbled out, and the sound of the wind howling through the cracked windows was the only noise. The door swung open with a jarring creak, and in walked a man, tall, impossibly thin, his clothes black and worn, his face pale like the first light of dawn. His eyes were dark, deep, sunken into his face like holes left after something had been gouged out. There was no color in them, just emptiness. He sat at the bar, and Marla hesitated before approaching him. There was something about the man that made her feel uneasy. Maybe it was the way he looked, or the way the air seemed to shift when he entered. But she forced a smile, doing her job, and asked, "What'll it be?" "Just a beer?" he said, his voice rough like gravel. His hand trembled as he placed it on the counter, but his eyes never left hers. Not once. She poured the beer, watching him closely. There was something wrong with the way he moved, like his joints were too stiff, too precise, like he wasn't quite a part of the world. She slid the glass over to him, hoping he wouldn't say anything more, but he did. "You know," he said, his voice low, "I'm not really here for a drink." Marla frowned. "Then why?" He smiled, but it was a thin, unsettling thing. "I'm waiting for them." "For who?" But he didn't answer. He didn't need to. The door banged open again, the wind howling in like a creature of the night, and when Marla turned back to the bar, the man was gone. The beer glass was still there, half empty. But the bar wasn't the same. The shadows seemed deeper, more oppressive. The air had thickened. Marla's heart skipped a beat as she looked up. In the corner of the tavern stood the dead oak, the twisted thing that had been cut down years ago. Its gnarled branches were covered in dark, writhing shadows, the very essence of decay. And then she saw them. Them. The people who had been drinking earlier, their faces as hollow and vacant as the pale man's. They were watching her now, and in their eyes, she could see it. They had already been taken. It was too late. Sarah had always been a skeptic. Raised in a family of pragmatists, she didn't believe in ghost stories or urban legends. When she first started working at the Last Sip pub, she thought the old building was just that, old. The kind of place where the walls had seen too much, the floors creaked too loudly, and the air felt thick with years of spilled beer and cigarette smoke. Nothing more. It was a late Wednesday night when she first noticed something wasn't right. The pub was nearly empty, the last of the patrons nursing their drinks, their voices low and muffled. But then, the door opened. It wasn't the usual creak of the door. This time, it sounded more like the groan of something ancient, something long forgotten. In walked a man, shrouded in the kind of darkness that seemed to follow him. He was old, too old for a man who still frequented bars, and his eyes were wrong. They were glazed over, like someone who had seen too much, or perhaps someone who had already passed on, but hadn't moved on. He shuffled to the bar, and Sarah, despite herself, felt a cold shiver crawl up her spine. His voice, when he ordered a drink, was a low rasp, like something that had been buried too long. "1 whiskey," he said, "and leave the bottle." Sarah poured the drink, but before she could reach for the bottle, he stopped her. "I've been waiting a long time for this," he whispered, "and now I'm ready." His hand trembled as he took the glass, but he didn't drink it. Instead, he set it down on the bar and looked her in the eyes. "You've served the last drink, you know. It's all part of the game." Sarah didn't understand, not at first. But then the air grew colder. The shadows in the corners deepened. The silence in the pub stretched, a taut string ready to snap. The man's voice was barely above a whisper, but the words seemed to fill the room, hanging in the air like the scent of something rotting. Sarah took a step back, her heart pounding in her chest as she looked at the old man, his eyes unblinking, unfeeling, like something ancient that had seen too much. The silence in the pub had grown thick, suffocating. The only sound was the low hum of the refrigerator behind the bar, and yet it felt like a vacuum, drawing the sound out of the room entirely. Sarah's fingers tightened around the whiskey bottle, but she couldn't bring herself to lift it. The man's eyes held her in place, and for the first time in her life, she felt something she couldn't explain. A sense of wrongness that crawled beneath her skin, making her stomach twist. "You've served the last drink, you know," the man repeated, his voice now like the rasp of dried leaves. "You've handed out the final glass. The game is over." What do you mean?" Sarah stammered, trying to maintain her composure. He leaned in, his face so close now that she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the veins underneath his pale skin that seemed to pulse with a slow, steady beat. His breath smelled of decay, of something long dead. "You can feel it too, can't you?" he asked softly. "The air, it's different tonight, heavier. You're not alone in here, girl, not anymore."